In the golden darkness of a movie theater in 1939, an American audience watches as Vivian Leigh descends a staircase at 12 Oaks, her dark hair gleaming under impossible light. Every curl sits perfectly. Every strand obeys. In the same year, audiences will watch Judy Garland skip down a yellow brick road, her braids swinging with mechanical precision. They will watch Clark Gable raise an eyebrow at Scarlett O'Hara, his hairline as sharp and unmoving as a painted line. What they do not see are the hands that built these images, the hours in the chair, the burn of electrolysis needles, the wig rooms storing thousands of hairpieces, the contracts that made a star's very scalp the property of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer or Warner Brothers or Paramount Pictures. This is the story of Hollywood's most guarded secret. Not scandal, not affairs, but something more fundamental. The fact that the faces America fell in love with were constructions maintained by an industrial system as vast and intricate as the sound stages themselves. Hollywood in its golden age operated on a simple principle. Stars must be perfect. Not talented, not charismatic. Perfect. The camera demanded it. The audience expected it. And the studio system existed to manufacture it. But perfection does not exist in nature. Human beings age. Hair thins. Hairlines recede. Faces show the marks of time and stress and genetics. In the world outside Hollywood, this was accepted as the normal course of life. Inside Hollywood, it was a problem to be solved. And solve it they did with an efficiency and thoroughness that would have impressed any factory manager. The stars of Hollywood's golden age were products, carefully designed and meticulously maintained. When nature failed to provide the raw materials for perfection, Hollywood had developed an entire industry to manufacture it. The system they built would shape not just the careers of individual stars, but the very concept of beauty itself. The standards created in studio wig rooms and makeup departments in the 1930s and 1940s would echo through generations, defining what Americans considered beautiful, acceptable, worthy of love and admiration. This is the story of that system, of the people who built it, of the stars who lived within it, and of the cost of perfection that no one discussed but everyone paid. Act 1. The Architecture of Illusion, the Birth of the Studio Hair Machine. In 1917, a wigmaker named George Westmore walked onto a film set and changed Hollywood forever. Before Westmore, actors applied their own makeup, styled their own hair, often with disastrous results under the hot, unforgiving lights of early film stock. The transition from stage to screen had exposed a fundamental problem. What worked in the theater viewed from a distance failed utterly when captured on film and magnified on a screen. Westmore understood that film required a different approach entirely. He opened the first makeup department at a Hollywood studio, establishing the principle that appearance on screen was too important to be left to the actors themselves. It needed specialists. It needed systems. It needed control. Within a decade, George Westmore's sons would run the makeup and hair departments at every major studio in Hollywood. Monty at Paramount, Perk at Warner Brothers, Ern at RKO, Wally at Universal, Bud at Columbia. The Westmore dynasty didn't just style Hollywood, they built the very concept that a star's appearance could and should be controlled, managed, and when necessary, completely reconstructed. The Westmores brought to Hollywood an understanding that hair was not merely personal grooming. It was architecture. Each wig, each hairpiece, each carefully styled wave served a specific purpose in creating the character on screen. They understood light and shadow, how different hair colors photographed under different lighting conditions, how a hairline could change the apparent shape of a face. More importantly, they understood that consistency was essential. A star needed to look the same in every publicity photo, every scene, every public appearance. Natural hair, with its tendency to grow and change and behave unpredictably, was an obstacle to consistency. Wigs and hairpieces provided control. Sidney Guilaroff, the architect of MGM Beauty. By the mid-1930s, every major studio had a hair department that functioned like a small factory. But none was larger or more influential than the operation at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and none was run by anyone quite like Sidney Guilaroff. Guilaroff arrived at MGM in 1934, brought in by studio chief Louis B. Mayer to oversee the hair of the studio's stable of stars. He would remain there for nearly 4 decades, styling hair for more than 1,000 films. His client list read like a catalog of Hollywood royalty: Greta Garbo, Joan Crawford, Katharine Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor, Grace Kelly, Ava Gardner. If you were a star at MGM, your hair belonged to Sidney Guilaroff. In 1941, Guilaroff became the first hairdresser in Hollywood history to receive on-screen credit. The credit appeared in the opening titles of The Women, and it marked a fundamental shift in how the industry viewed the craft of creating a star's image. When Guilaroff's name appeared in the credits, it was an acknowledgement of a simple truth. Hair was not merely grooming. It was storytelling. It was character. It was, in many ways, the star itself. Guilaroff understood this better than perhaps anyone in Hollywood. He did not merely style hair. He created identities. The decision to make Lucille Ball a redhead was not a styling choice. It was brand development. The careful maintenance of Joan Crawford's severe, controlled hairstyles was not fashion. It was character consistency. The elaborate period wigs created for historical epics were not costumes. They were the foundation upon which entire visual worlds were built. The scale of Guilaroff's operation was staggering. The wig room at MGM occupied an entire floor of the studio's makeup building. It was climate-controlled to preserve the delicate human hair that made up the wigs. It was cataloged with the precision of a library, each piece labeled and stored according to color, length, style, and period. On any given day, dozens of wigs were in use on the studio's various sound stages, while hundreds more waited in storage. For the 1938 production of Marie Antoinette, Guilaroff's department created thousands of wigs and hairpieces. The film, starring Norma Shearer as the doomed French queen, required elaborate 18th-century hairstyles that no modern actress could possibly achieve with her own hair. The wigs needed to be historically accurate, photographically perfect, and able to withstand the intense heat of film lights. Each one was hand-knotted with individual hairs tied into a lace base that created the illusion of a natural scalp. The cost was extraordinary. A single high-quality wig could cost more than the average American worker made in a year. But for MGM, which operated under the principle that only the best was good enough, the cost was justified. The wigs were not expenses. They were investments in the illusion. Human hair was purchased from women across America and Europe. The hair was sorted by color and texture, then washed and treated before being knotted into wig caps. The process was slow and required extraordinary skill. A wigmaker might spend weeks on a single piece, knotting hair strand by strand to create a hairline that looked natural under the scrutiny of the camera. The results were often breathtaking. A good wig was undetectable on screen. It moved like natural hair. It caught light like natural hair. It allowed cinematographers to create the perfect image without worrying about an actress's real hair behaving unpredictably. Max Factor, the technology of perfection. If the Westmores built the institutional structure for Hollywood's hair and makeup control, and Guilaroff perfected the art of individual star styling, it was Max Factor who provided the technology that made it all possible. Factor, a Polish immigrant who had worked as a wigmaker for the Russian royal family before coming to America, understood the technical requirements of film in a way that few others did. Early film stock was primitive by modern standards, requiring intense lighting that exposed every flaw and imperfection. Under those lights, natural makeup looked garish. Natural hair looked thin and lifeless. Factor developed makeup specifically formulated for film, products that looked natural under intense lights and through the camera lens. But his most significant contribution to Hollywood's perfection industry was his work with wigs and hairpieces. Factor persuaded major directors to use high-quality human hair wigs and hairpieces, arguing that they provided a level of control impossible with natural hair. He was right. A wig could be styled once and maintain that style through an entire day of shooting. It could be replicated exactly for retakes film days or weeks apart. It could be designed to photograph perfectly under specific lighting conditions. More importantly, wigs allowed for rapid transformations that would have been impossible with natural hair. An actress could play a blonde in one film and a brunette in next without subjecting her real hair to harsh dyes and treatments. An actor could play a young man in the morning and an old man in the afternoon with nothing more than a wig change. Factor built a business renting wigs and hairpieces to productions, maintaining a vast inventory that rivaled that of the studios themselves. The rental model meant that even smaller productions could afford high-quality hairpieces, spreading the technology of perfection throughout the industry. By the late 1930s, the use of wigs and hairpieces was so common that it was simply accepted as standard practice. Directors budgeted for them. Cinematographers planned lighting around them. Actors understood that whatever they were asked to do with their own hair, there would likely be a wig or hairpiece to either enhance it or replace it entirely. The system was complete. A star's hair was studio property in everything but name, managed by chiefs like Sidney Guilaroff at MGM and the Westmore dynasty across town. The infrastructure was in place. The technology was perfected. And the standards of beauty that this system would enforce were absolute. The daily reality, how the system worked. Understanding the system requires understanding the daily reality of how it operated. A star under contract to a major studio in the 1940s did not wake up and style their own hair before going to work. They reported to the studio in the morning, often as early as 5 or 6 o'clock, and spent hours in the makeup and hair departments before they were allowed anywhere near a camera. For women, the process was extensive. Natural hair was washed, treated, and prepared to either be styled or serve as the foundation for a wig or hairpiece. If the role required a specific look that differed significantly from the actress's natural hair, a wig would be selected from a studio's inventory or, for major productions, custom-built by the hair department. The wig would be fitted carefully, with a lace front position to create a natural-looking hairline. The join between the wig and the actress's real hairline would be concealed with makeup. The wig would then be styled according to the requirements of the scene. The entire process could take 2 to 3 hours. For men wearing hairpieces, the process was somewhat quicker, but no less exacting. The hairpiece would be positioned and secured, the joins concealed, any exposed natural hair blended with the piece. The result needed to be undetectable, not just to the audience watching the film, but to the other actors working inches away. Once on set, the hair department staff would remain present throughout the day. Between takes, they would check and adjust. Any stray hair would be smoothed. Any shift in the wig or hairpiece would be corrected. The perfection established in the morning had to be maintained through 12 or 14 hours of shooting. For stars filming multiple projects or transitioning between films, the demands were even greater. An actress might finish a film as a redhead and be required to be a blonde for her next role. If she was using her natural hair, this meant harsh chemical treatments. If she was using wigs, it meant careful scheduling and coordination between projects to ensure continuity. The system was efficient, but it was also exhausting. Stars spent more time in the makeup and hair departments than they did in front of cameras. Their mornings began in chairs, their heads being pulled and manipulated and transformed. For many, it became a routine so familiar that they could sleep through much of it, waking only when the transformation was complete. But familiarity did not make it comfortable. The constant handling of hair, the chemicals, the heat from styling tools and lights, the weight of elaborate wigs, all of it took a physical toll. And beyond the physical discomfort was the psychological reality of having no control over one's own appearance, of being reshaped according to someone else's vision of what you should look like. Act 2. Engineering Perfection. The Women Rita Hayworth. The Blueprint. In 1937, a young dancer named Margarita Carmen Cancino signed a contract with Columbia Pictures. She was 19 years old, talented, beautiful by any reasonable standard, and by Hollywood standards wrong. Her hairline was too low. Her hair was too dark. Her features read as too ethnic for leading roles in an industry that had very specific, very narrow ideas about what a star should look like. Columbia Pictures, led by the notoriously controlling Harry Cohn, had a solution. It would take 2 years to complete, and it would be painful. Rita Hayworth's transformation. The name itself was studio-created, a combination of her mother's maiden name and a first name chosen for its perceived American quality, was one of the most methodical reconstructions of a human being in Hollywood history. It was also one of the most thoroughly documented, making it the clearest example we have of how studios engineered perfection. The process began with her hairline. Cohn and his executives decided that Margarita's hairline was too low, making her forehead appear small and her features less refined. The solution was electrolysis, a process in which a thin needle is inserted into each individual hair follicle, and an electric current is passed through it to destroy the root permanently. Several times a week for 2 years, Hayworth underwent these treatments. Each session lasted hours. Each session was painful. The needle had to be inserted and repositioned again and again, follicle by follicle, working along her hairline to raise it to the studio's specifications. The pain was not merely physical. Hayworth would later speak about the humiliation of being told, repeatedly and systematically, that her natural face was wrong, that she needed to be fixed, that the woman she was born as was not acceptable for public consumption. But Columbia was thorough. As the electrolysis slowly reshaped her hairline, raising it nearly an inch, the studio also changed her hair color. Her natural dark brown hair was lightened and dyed auburn, a shade that photographed as a luminous red in Technicolor. The color became her trademark, but it required constant maintenance. Repeated dyeing damaged her hair, making wigs and hairpieces increasingly necessary as her career progressed. The transformation was completed with dental work, weight management, and careful training in how to speak, move, and present herself. By 1939, when she appeared in Only Angels Have Wings opposite Cary Grant, Margarita Cancino no longer existed. In her place was Rita Hayworth, a creation of Columbia Pictures. The studio's investment paid off spectacularly. Hayworth became one of the biggest stars of the 1940s. Her image appeared on magazine covers worldwide. She was voted the era's top love goddess. During World War II, her photograph was the most popular pinup image among American servicemen. The hair that Columbia had chemically altered and dyed became one of the most famous heads of hair in the world. But Hayworth herself never forgot what had been done to create that image. In interviews later in life, she spoke about feeling like a fraud, like the woman the world loved was not real. She said that men fell in love with Gilda, the character from her most famous film, and woke up with her. The implication was clear. The real woman could never live up to the engineered image. The electrolysis that raised her hairline was permanent. Even if Hayworth had wanted to return to her original appearance, she could not. The follicles had been destroyed. The hair would never grow back. For the rest of her life, she would have the face that Columbia Pictures had designed for her. Rita Hayworth's story is significant because it is documented and acknowledged. She herself spoke about the transformation. The studio publicized it, at least in broad strokes, as part of her Cinderella narrative. But what made it into the fan magazines was the after, not the during. The public saw the beautiful result. They did not see the hours of painful electrolysis. They did not know that the face they adored had been quite literally reconstructed. And they certainly did not consider what it might mean for a young woman to be told that her natural face was unacceptable, that she needed to be remade, that her very ethnicity needed to be erased for her to be worthy of stardom. Lucille Ball, manufacturing identity. When Lucille Ball arrived at MGM in the early 1930s, she was one of dozens of young contract players hoping to break through to stardom. She was blonde, reasonably attractive, and utterly unremarkable. In a studio system that valued distinctiveness, being unremarkable was a career death sentence. Sidney Guilaroff saw something different when he looked at Ball. Or rather, he saw what she could become. In his vision, she was not a blonde. She was a redhead. Not just any redhead, but a particular shade of red that did not exist in nature, vibrant, impossible, instantly recognizable. The transformation was not instantaneous. Guilaroff worked with Ball over time, developing the exact shade that would become her signature. The color had to photograph perfectly in both black and white and Technicolor. It had to stand out without looking garish. It had to be distinctive enough to make Ball memorable, but not so unusual as to limit the types of roles she could play. The process required constant maintenance. Ball's natural dark blonde hair had to be lightened and then dyed to achieve the red. The harsh chemicals damaged her hair, requiring repeated treatments that damaged it further. As her hair weakened, wigs and hairpieces became increasingly necessary. By the time Ball transitioned from films to television in the 1950s, she was wearing wigs or extensive hairpieces for most of her work. But the strategy worked. The red hair made Lucille Ball distinctive. In publicity photos, she stood out. On screen, the camera found her. When she finally achieved stardom in the 1950s with I Love Lucy, the red hair was so associated with her that it became central to the character. Lucy Ricardo was, in many ways, built around that hair color, around the identity that had been created for Ball years earlier in a studio hair department. The irony is that the color that became synonymous with Lucille Ball, that made her one of the most recognizable faces in American entertainment history, was not her choice. It was Sidney Guilaroff's choice, made in service of MGM's need to differentiate its contract players. Ball wore the color because she was told to. She maintained it because not maintaining it would have meant losing the visual identity that had finally made her a star. Even decades later, when Ball was one of the most powerful women in television, when she owned her own production company and had creative control over her work, she remained tied to that shade of red. It was what audiences expected. It was what made her recognizable. The identity that had been assigned to her when she was a powerless contract player had become so fundamental to her public image that abandoning it was unthinkable. What began as a technical decision, what color photographs best, what makes this actress stand out, became the foundation of an identity. And that identity was owned, first by MGM, and later by the public's expectations. Ball herself existed somewhere within it, but she was not identical to it. Judy Garland, the pressure of perfection. Judy Garland signed with MGM at 13 years old. From that moment until she left the studio nearly 2 decades later, every aspect of her physical appearance was controlled, managed, and when necessary, altered to meet the studio's standards. MGM had positioned Garland as the girl next door, the wholesome American teenager who could sing like an angel. The image required careful maintenance. Her weight was monitored obsessively, with studio executives commenting on every pound gained or lost. Her teeth were capped to create a more perfect smile. And her hair, soft, naturally brown, with a tendency to frizz in the California heat, became the property of Sidney Guilaroff's department. For The Wizard of Oz, filmed when Garland was just 16, her hair was set in tight pin curls each morning to create Dorothy's braids. The style had to be perfect for every scene, which meant hours in the chair before filming could begin. The curls were set so tightly that they pulled at her scalp. Under the hot lights of the Technicolor cameras, her head would ache. But The Wizard of Oz was just the beginning. As Garland's career progressed, the demands only increased. Each film required a new look. Each public appearance required perfection. Her hair had to be styled exactly right, not just for the camera, but for the photographers who followed her everywhere, for the fans who wanted to see their star looking perfect at all times. The pressure on Garland was not unique, but it was particularly intense. She had started young, which meant she had spent her entire adolescence being told that her natural appearance was not good enough, that she needed to be improved, that perfection was expected at all times. She had no memory of a time when her body was her own, when her hair was something she controlled. The studio's control extended beyond styling. When Garland's hair began to thin from the constant chemical treatments and tight styling, the studio provided wigs and hairpieces. When she gained weight, the studio put her on diet pills that would contribute to addiction issues that plagued her for life. When she showed signs of exhaustion from the brutal schedule, the studio gave her pills to wake up and pills to sleep. The system that controlled Garland's hair was the same system that controlled every other aspect of her life and body. It was all part of the same philosophy, that a star was not a person but a product, and products could be improved, adjusted, and maintained according to the manufacturer's specifications. Garland would eventually speak about feeling like she was never allowed to be herself, that Judy Garland was a character she played rather than who she actually was. The girl next door with the perfect braids and the pure voice was a construction. And the woman inside that construction was never given the space to breathe, to be imperfect, to be human. By the time Garland left MGM in 1950, she was 28 years old and looked older. The years of chemical treatments on her hair, the constant styling, the wigs and hairpieces had taken their toll. Her hair was damaged, thinning in places. But more than the physical damage was the psychological cost of spending 15 years being told that you are not enough as you are, that you need to be fixed, that your value lies in maintaining an image that requires denying your own humanity. Bette Davis, the cost of transformation. Bette Davis was never Hollywood's conventional beauty. When she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1930s, studio executives were uncertain what to do with her. Her eyes were too prominent, her features too sharp, her persona too intense. But she was a brilliant actress, and Warner Brothers eventually built an empire on her talent. What they could not protect her from was the physical cost of that career. Davis threw herself into roles with an intensity that few of her contemporaries matched. She was willing to do whatever a role required, including dramatic alterations to her appearance. For Of Human Bondage in 1934, she appeared deliberately unglamorous, a choice that was shocking for a Hollywood actress at the time. For The Virgin Queen in 1955, she shaved her head to play Queen Elizabeth I. The head shaving for The Virgin Queen was not the first time Davis had sacrificed her hair for a role, but would be one she remembered. She was 47 years old, and hair once shaved often does not grow back the same way. Davis found that her hair grew back thinner, with bald patches that required careful styling to conceal. Years later, actress Mia Farrow would recall Davis warning her about wigs and hairpieces when Farrow was considering shaving her own head for a role. Davis, who had experienced significant hair loss and had struggled with the consequences for years, understood something that younger actresses did not. The tools used to create beauty on screen often destroyed it off-screen. The hot lights that made everything look perfect on film-damaged hair over time. The harsh chemicals and dyes and permanent solutions weaken it. The tension wigs that pulled at the scalp could cause traction alopecia, a type of hair loss caused by constant pulling. The electrolysis that reshaped hairlines destroyed follicles permanently. All of it took a toll. Davis's caution came from personal experience. She had lived through the consequences of Hollywood's demands on her appearance. She had lost hair. She had dealt with the reality that the tools used to create perfection in one's 20s and 30s left permanent marks in one's 40s and 50s. But her warning to Farrow also revealed something about how the system perpetuated itself. Davis had paid the price, but she could only warn younger actresses. She could not change the system. She could not protect them from the same demands that had been placed on her. The industry would continue to ask women to sacrifice their hair, their health, their bodies for roles. And women who wanted to work would continue to say yes. Joan Crawford, control through appearance. Joan Crawford understood early in her career that controlling her image was essential to maintaining power in Hollywood. She worked closely with studio hair and makeup departments, but she also imposed her own standards that were often more demanding than those of the studios themselves. Crawford's hair became one of her signatures. The style changed over the decades, from the finger waves of the 1930s to the more structured looks of the 1940s and 1950s, but it was always perfectly controlled. Not a hair out of place. Not a strand moving independently. Crawford's hair did not behave like human hair. It behaved like sculpture. Achieving this required extensive use of wigs and hairpieces, heavy styling products, and constant maintenance. Crawford reportedly would not be seen in public without her hair being perfect, which meant either wearing a wig or spending significant time each day on styling. The control she maintained over her hair was part of a larger control she maintained over every aspect of her public image. But Crawford's story also illustrates the trap that the system created. By accepting and even embracing the demands of perfection, she gained power and longevity in an industry that often discarded women as they aged. But she also enslaved herself to maintaining that perfection. She could never relax. She could never be seen as merely human. The image she had cultivated so carefully became a prison of her own making. The female experience, a pattern of sacrifice. The stories of Rita Hayworth, Lucille Ball, Judy Garland, Bette Davis, and Joan Crawford reveal a pattern. The women of Hollywood's golden age were asked to sacrifice their natural appearances, often permanently, to meet standards they had no part in creating. They underwent painful procedures. They subjected their hair and skin to harsh chemicals. They wore wigs that damaged their scalps. They allowed their hairlines to be reshaped, their hair color to be changed, their very faces to be altered. And they did this not once, but repeatedly, over careers that spanned decades. The transformation was not a single event, but a constant process of maintenance and adjustment. Every new film required a new look. Every public appearance required perfection. The work was never done. The cost was both physical and psychological. The physical damage, hair loss, scalp damage, the permanent alteration of hairlines through electrolysis, was real and often irreversible. But the psychological cost may have been even greater. These women internalized the message that they were not enough as they were, that their natural selves were insufficient, that their value lay in maintaining an artificial image. This is perhaps the darkest legacy of Hollywood's beauty machine. It was not just that it created false images. It was that it convinced the women who embodied those images that they were not enough without the transformation, that their natural hair was wrong, that their natural faces were unacceptable. That perfection was not just desirable, but necessary. And because these women were among the most famous, most celebrated, most photographed people in America, their transformed images became the standard against which all women were measured. The engineered perfection of Hollywood's golden age became America's ideal of beauty. And millions of American women, comparing themselves to that impossible standard, found themselves wanting. Act 3. The men documented and speculated the hairpiece as professional tool. If the women of Hollywood's golden age were subjected to transformations that were often painful and permanent, the men faced a different kind of reconstruction. For male stars, the solution to hair loss was simpler, more reversible, and far more common than the public ever knew. The toupee or hairpiece was standard equipment in Hollywood by the 1940s. It was not scandal. It was not secret in the way we think of secrets today. It was simply another part of the costume, another tool in the construction of the star image. The difference was that while audiences knew that Clark Gable wore costumes, they were not supposed to know that his hair might be one of them. The use of hairpieces by male stars reveals something important about how Hollywood thought about male versus female beauty. Women's beauty was expected to appear natural, effortless, as if they simply woke up looking perfect. The labor of creating that beauty had to be invisible. Men's appearance, by contrast, was allowed to be more obviously constructed. A toupee was, in a sense, honest about its artificiality. It was a tool, a piece of equipment, no different than a prop or a costume piece. This difference was not accidental. It reflected the different ways Hollywood thought about male and female stars and the different kinds of power they held. Male stars generally had more control over their careers and their images. They could negotiate. They could refuse certain demands. And when they wore hairpieces, they wore them on their own terms. John Wayne, the documented case. John Wayne's use of a hairpiece is one of the best documented cases of male hair replacement in Hollywood history. By most accounts, including those of makeup artists who worked with him and biographers who studied his career, Wayne began wearing a toupee sometime around 1948 after filming Wake of the Red Witch. He would wear hairpieces for the rest of his career, both on screen and in most public appearances. What makes Wayne's case particularly significant is that he occasionally acknowledged it. In conversations with reporters and colleagues, Wayne would touch his hair and quip that it was real hair, just not his own. The joke acknowledged the hairpiece while deflecting any sense of shame about it. For Wayne, the toupee was a practical tool, no different than the boots or the gun belt. It was part of the Duke's costume, part of the image of masculine strength and virility that made him one of Hollywood's biggest stars for 3 decades. Wayne's openness, limited as it was, reveals something important about how hairpieces functioned in Hollywood's construction of masculinity. The hairpiece was not a sign of weakness or vanity. It was a professional necessity. Under film lights, a receding hairline or thinning crown could make a leading man look older, less vital. The hairpiece maintained the image of strength and virility that was essential to Wayne's screen persona. Wayne's natural hair had begun thinning in his 30s, a normal part of aging for many men. But John Wayne was not allowed to age normally. The characters he played, tough cowboys, military heroes, men of action, required a certain look. That look included a full head of hair, even when the man playing the role no longer had one. The decision to wear a toupee was likely not difficult for Wayne. The alternative was to accept character roles, to play older men, to acknowledge on screen what was happening to him in real life. The toupee allowed him to continue playing leading men, to maintain his status as a major star, to extend his career by decades. But the fact that he felt the need to joke about it, to acknowledge it in a way that diffused any potential criticism, suggests that even for a man as powerful and confident as John Wayne, there was some awareness that wearing a hairpiece was something that needed explaining. The joke said, "I know you might think this is vanity, but it's not. It's just part of the job." Bing Crosby, the reluctant participant. Bing Crosby's relationship with his hairpiece was more complicated. According to his biographer Gary Giddens, Crosby wore a toupee for films and public appearances, but he was far from enthusiastic about it. Crosby's disdain was captured in his description of the hairpiece as a scalp doily, a phrase that perfectly expressed his view of it as an absurd but necessary piece of artifice. During World War II, when Crosby performed for troops on USO tours, he often refused to wear the hairpiece. His reasoning, as he explained to Giddens, was simple. He would not wear anything phony for the troops. The men he was entertaining were risking their lives. The least he could do was show them his real face, receding hairline and all. Crosby's decision reveals a tension that existed for many male stars. The hairpiece was required for the screen image, for the perfection that Hollywood demanded. But away from the camera, away from the controlled environment of the studio, some men chafed at the requirement to maintain the illusion. For Crosby, who had built a career on projecting authenticity and relatability, the hairpiece represented everything he found false about Hollywood. On screen, he would wear it because the role required it. But when he was performing as himself, when he was connecting with real people in real circumstances, he refused. The fact that Crosby felt he could make this choice reveals his power within the industry. Lesser stars, stars with less leverage, might not have been able to refuse. But Crosby, who was one of the biggest stars in America throughout the 1940s and 1950s, had the clout to decide when he would and would not maintain the illusion. Fred Astaire, the professional standard. Fred Astaire's relationship with hairpieces is less clearly documented, but follows a pattern that was likely common among male stars of his generation. Period anecdotes and fan scholarship suggest that Astaire wore hairpieces for many of his film appearances, particularly as he aged and his natural hair thinned. There are accounts of him appearing in public without the hairpiece, particularly during wartime USO shows, similar to Bing Crosby. What seems clear from the available evidence is that if Astaire did wear hairpieces, he treated them as professional tools. They were on for the camera, off when the performance ended. This was likely the standard practice for many male stars. The hairpiece was part of the costume, worn when needed, removed when not. Astaire's dancing placed unique demands on any hairpiece he might have worn. The physical exertion, the sweat, the movement, all of it meant that any hairpiece had to be secured more carefully than it would be for an actor who simply stood and delivered lines. The technology had to be reliable. The adhesive had to hold under conditions that would defeat lesser solutions. If Astaire did wear hairpieces, and the evidence suggests he did at least sometimes, then he represents the intersection of Hollywood's perfection demands with the practical realities of performance. The hairpiece could not be merely cosmetic. It had to function under the most demanding circumstances. The murky territory, speculation versus documentation. When it comes to other major stars of the era, Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, Cary Grant, Gary Cooper, James Stewart, the evidence becomes considerably less clear. These men are frequently cited in lists of stars who wore hairpieces. The claims are repeated across fan sites, Hollywood histories, and popular articles. But primary sources are harder to find. This is where we must be honest about what we know and what we do not know. Studio makeup records from this era were not systematically preserved. Personal accounts from makeup artists and hairdressers who worked with these stars are scattered and sometimes conflicting. The culture of discretion that surrounded Hollywood in the Golden Age meant that many of these details were deliberately not recorded or discussed publicly. What can be said with confidence is this: hairpieces were common in Hollywood during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. The technology was sophisticated. The stigma within the industry was low. Many leading men used hairpieces at some point in their careers. The question is not whether hairpieces were used, but rather which specific stars used them, and under what circumstances. Clark Gable is often mentioned as having worn a hairpiece, particularly later in his career. Photographs from different periods of his career do show what appear to be changes in his hairline that could be consistent with hairpiece use. But without direct testimony from Gable himself, from makeup artists who worked with him, or from studio records, we are left with educated speculation rather than documented fact. The same is true for Humphrey Bogart, Cary Grant, and others. The claims exist. The repetition of those claims has given them weight. But the primary documentation is often missing. This matters because it illustrates an important point about how Hollywood's system of perfection actually worked. The system depended on not just creating illusions, but on maintaining discretion about how those illusions were created. Whether a particular star wore a hairpiece was not something that was discussed, documented, or acknowledged. The goal was seamless perfection, and seamless meant that the seams, the wig lines, the adhesive, the construction, were never visible or discussed. Why male and female treatment differed. The contrast between how male and female stars dealt with hair loss and imperfection is striking and revealing. Women underwent permanent alterations. Electrolysis that destroyed hair follicles forever. Chemical treatments that damaged their natural hair. Wigs that pulled at their scalps for hours each day. The solutions for women were invasive, painful, and often irreversible. Men wore removable hairpieces that could be put on in the morning and taken off at night. The hairpiece required no permanent alteration to the man's body. It caused no lasting damage. It was, in every sense, a temporary and reversible solution. This difference was not accidental. It reflected the fundamentally different ways Hollywood thought about male and female beauty and about male and female bodies. A woman's appearance was expected to be natural, or at least to appear natural. The ideal was that beauty should seem effortless, as if the woman simply woke up looking perfect. The work of creating that beauty had to be invisible. And so the solutions were permanent, designed to reshape the woman herself rather than to temporarily enhance her appearance. A man's appearance was allowed to be more obviously constructed. The toupee was, in a sense, honest about its artificiality. It was openly a tool, a piece of equipment. And because men in Hollywood had more power than women, they had more control over when and how they used these tools. John Wayne could joke about his hairpiece because he had the power to control his own narrative. He was valuable enough, powerful enough, that he could acknowledge the artifice without damaging his image. Rita Hayworth could not joke about her electrolysis because the studio controlled her narrative, and the studio's narrative required that her beauty appear natural and effortless. Bing Crosby could refuse to wear his hairpiece for USO troops because he had the power to make that choice. Judy Garland could not refuse the studio's demands about her hair, her weight, or any other aspect of her appearance because she had no power to refuse. The different treatments were not just about different technologies or different aesthetic standards. They were about power. And in Hollywood's golden age, men had it and women did not. The silence around male hair loss. Another significant difference was how male hair loss was treated in the culture at large versus in Hollywood. Outside of Hollywood, male pattern baldness was accepted as a normal part of aging. Men lost their hair. It was unfortunate but not tragic. It did not make them unemployable or unlovable or worthless. But in Hollywood, male hair loss was treated as a problem to be solved, a flaw to be concealed. The leading man was expected to be virile, strong, in the prime of life. A receding hairline undermined that image. And so hairpieces became standard practice, not to hide aging, but to pretend it was not happening. The silence around this practice reveals how deeply Hollywood had committed to the illusion of perfection. Even for men, who faced far less invasive procedures than women, the use of hairpieces was not discussed publicly. The goal was to maintain the fantasy that these men naturally looked the way they appeared on screen. This silence extended beyond the studios. Fan magazines, which covered every other aspect of stars' lives in exhaustive detail, rarely, if ever, mentioned hairpieces. Photographers knew not to capture angles that might reveal a wig line. Other actors knew not to mention it in interviews. The conspiracy of silence was industry-wide. And it worked. Audiences in the 1940s and 1950s largely did not know that many of their favorite male stars wore hairpieces. They saw the perfection on screen and assumed it was real. The illusion was complete. Act 4, the machinery of control contracts, codifying control. The power studios held over their stars' appearances was not informal or accidental. It was enshrined in law, codified in the contracts that every actor signed when they agreed to work for a major studio. These contracts were extraordinary documents, running to dozens of pages and covering every conceivable aspect of a star's professional and personal life. But some of the most intrusive clauses dealt with physical appearance. Weight clauses specified exact pounds that an actor was required to maintain. Regular weigh-ins were mandatory. Failure to maintain the required weight could result in suspension without pay. For actresses, the required weights were often dangerously low, contributing to eating disorders and unhealthy relationships with food that lasted lifetimes. Appearance clauses gave the studio the right to change hair color, style, even facial features if they deemed it necessary for the star's career or for a particular role. An actress could not dye her hair a different color without studio approval. An actor could not grow a beard or shave his head without permission. Even something as simple as a haircut required going through the studio hair department. The studios justified these clauses by arguing that they had invested significant money in building a star's image, and that image was valuable property that needed to be protected. This was true as far as it went. The studios did invest heavily in publicity, in carefully constructed narratives about who their stars were. But the logical extension of this argument was that the star's body, the star's face, the star's very physical self was not their own property, but the studio's. Morality clauses, which received more public attention, were often connected to appearance standards. A star who behaved in ways that damaged their carefully constructed image could be fired. But damage to the image could include anything from gaining weight to appearing in public without proper grooming. The standard was perfection, and the contracts made that standard legally enforceable. For stars early in their careers, these contracts were non-negotiable. If you wanted to work in Hollywood, you accepted the studio's terms. The alternative was to return to wherever you came from and give up on the dream of stardom. Even established stars often had limited ability to negotiate these clauses. The studios operated as an oligopoly. They might compete for top talent, but they agreed on the fundamental principle that appearance had to be controlled. A star who refused appearance clauses at one studio would find similar clauses waiting at the next. The contracts also specified what happened if a star violated their appearance requirements. Suspension without pay was common. For stars who were not yet wealthy, who had families to support or debts to pay, suspension was financially devastating. The threat of it was often enough to ensure compliance. The publicity department, manufacturing reality. If contracts provided the legal framework for controlling stars' appearances, the studio publicity departments provided the practical enforcement. These departments were vast operations, employing dozens of people whose sole job was to manage how stars appeared to the public. Publicity departments did not just promote films or arrange interviews. They constructed entire narratives about who stars were, what they stood for, what their lives were like. These narratives were carefully crafted to appeal to specific audiences and to reinforce the images that the studios wanted to sell. Part of this narrative construction involved controlling what the public saw of stars' appearances. If a star had undergone a transformation, a nose job, a hairline alteration, a significant weight loss, the publicity department would create a story to explain it. The story was rarely the truth. It was whatever made the star seem most appealing, most aspirational, most perfect. Rita Hayworth's transformation was presented as a Cinderella story, a plain girl made beautiful by the studio's expert guidance. The pain of the electrolysis was not mentioned. The fact that her ethnicity had been deliberately erased was downplayed. The story was about discovery and improvement, not about coercion and erasure. Judy Garland's weight fluctuations were explained as normal variations or the result of different film roles requiring different looks. The diet pills, the pressure, the obsessive monitoring were not part of the public story. Instead, the publicity department emphasized her girl-next-door normalcy, her relatability, even as they enforced standards that no normal girl could ever meet. The publicity departments also controlled photography. Studio photographers were employees, not independent journalists. They shot what they were told to shoot, from the angles they were told to use, with the lighting that made each star look best. They knew which stars required special handling to hide hairpieces or wigs. They knew which angles exposed imperfections that needed to be concealed. More importantly, the studios controlled the negatives. Any photograph that showed a star looking less than perfect was destroyed or locked away. The public saw only carefully curated images, each one designed to reinforce the illusion of perfection. Fan magazines, complicit media. The fan magazines that proliferated during Hollywood's golden age, Photoplay, Modern Screen, Silver Screen, and dozens of others, might have seemed like independent media covering the film industry. In reality, they were part of Hollywood's marketing apparatus. These magazines depended on access to stars for their content. That access was controlled by studio publicity departments. A magazine that ran unflattering photographs or critical stories would find itself cut off, unable to get interviews or exclusive images. And so the magazines learned to play by Hollywood's rules. The result was a media ecosystem that reinforced the illusion of perfection. Fan magazines ran the photographs that studios provided. They printed the stories that studios approved or planted. They participated in the construction and maintenance of star images. Articles about stars' beauty routines were common, but they rarely revealed the truth about how that beauty was actually achieved. Instead, they offered tips that suggested any woman could look like a movie star if she just tried hard enough. Use this face cream. Follow this exercise routine. Style your hair this way. The implication was that movie star beauty was accessible to everyone, when in reality it required industrial infrastructure, hours of professional labor each day, and often painful and expensive procedures. When transformations were discussed, they were presented as improvements, as examples of Hollywood know-how making ordinary women extraordinary. The violence of those transformations, the pain, the permanence, the psychological cost, was never part of the story. The fan magazines also enforced standards through their coverage of stars who failed to maintain perfection. Stars who gained weight were criticized. Stars who appeared in public looking less than perfect were photographed and mocked. The message was clear. Perfection was mandatory, and failure to maintain it would be punished with public humiliation. Cinematographers and directors, the technical enforcers. The creation of perfect images on screen depended not just on hair departments and makeup artists, but on the cinematographers and directors who knew how to photograph each star to best advantage. The great cinematographers of Hollywood's golden age were masters of light and shadow. They understood that different faces required different approaches. Some stars needed soft, diffused lighting to minimize imperfections. Others could tolerate harsher light that showed more detail. Some needed to be filmed from specific angles that minimized unflattering features or concealed hairpieces. This knowledge was professional courtesy, the kind of thing that was understood but rarely spoken aloud. A cinematographer who lit a star poorly, who exposed a wig line, or made a receding hairline obvious, was a cinematographer who would not work with that star again. In an industry built on relationships and repeat employment, that was a career-ending mistake. Directors also played a role in maintaining the illusion. They knew which stars required additional time in makeup. They knew which stars could not be asked to perform physically demanding scenes that might disturb carefully styled hair or dislodge hairpieces. They planned shooting schedules and shot lists with these limitations in mind. The collaboration between hair departments, makeup artists, cinematographers, and directors was seamless. Everyone involved understood that their job was not just to make good film, but to maintain the illusion of perfection. The star had to look flawless in every frame, and everyone on set was responsible for ensuring that happened. The photographers, controlling the image offset. Beyond the controlled environment of the film set, stars faced the cameras of press photographers and studio portrait photographers. Here, too, the system worked to maintain perfection. Studio portrait sessions were elaborate affairs, with lighting and posing carefully controlled to create the most flattering images. Stars would spend hours in makeup and hair before these sessions, and the photographers would shoot hundreds of images to get the handful that would be released to the public. Portrait photographers like George Hurl and Clarence Sinclair Bull became famous for their ability to make stars look impossibly glamorous. But they were not working in opposition to the stars. They were working with the hair departments, the makeup artists, and the studio's publicity departments to create images that reinforced the carefully constructed star personas. These photographers understood that their job was not documentary. They were not trying to capture what the star really looked like. They were trying to create the idealized image that the public wanted to see and that the studio needed to sell. Press photographers presented a different challenge. They were not studio employees, and they might photograph stars in uncontrolled situations, arriving at premieres, leaving restaurants, walking down the street. But here, too, the studios exerted control where they could. Studios employed fixers and publicists who would accompany stars to public events, ensuring they were never photographed in unflattering circumstances. Stars learned to be camera-ready at all times, to never appear in public without perfect hair and makeup. The price of fame was eternal vigilance. For the most powerful stars, studios could sometimes prevent the publication of unflattering photographs through legal threats or by leveraging their advertising budgets with magazines and newspapers. The message was clear: publish flattering images of our stars or lose access and advertising revenue. Act 5. Why Perfection Mattered: The Cultural Context of Depression, Escape and Fantasy. To understand why Hollywood demanded such absolute perfection from its stars, we must understand the historical moment in which this system developed. The studio system reached its full power in the 1930s, during the depths of the Great Depression. For millions of Americans, the Depression meant poverty, unemployment, hunger, and despair. The America of the 1930s was a country where families lost their homes, where men stood in bread lines, where the future seemed desperately uncertain. In this context, Hollywood offered something precious: escape. For the price of a movie ticket, Americans could spend 2 hours in a world utterly different from their own. They could watch stories about wealthy people in beautiful clothes, living in mansions, falling in love without worrying about money or jobs, or where the next meal would come from. And embodying these fantasies were stars who seemed to exist on a different plane of existence, impossibly beautiful, perfectly groomed, untouched by the ordinary struggles of life. This escapism was not accidental. It was Hollywood's business model. The studios understood that Americans did not want to see reality on screen. They saw reality every day, and it was grim. They wanted fantasy. They wanted to believe for a few hours that life could be beautiful, that beauty itself was possible. If the stars had appeared ordinary, if they had visible flaws or imperfections, the fantasy would collapse. The escape would fail. And so perfection became not just desirable, but necessary. The stars had to be perfect because perfection was the product Hollywood sold. The studio system's obsession with controlling every aspect of stars' appearances can be understood as a response to this economic reality. In an industry where image was everything, where the ability to sell fantasy determined survival, perfection could not be left to chance. It had to be manufactured, maintained, and protected at all costs. Post-war prosperity, the American image. After World War II, the cultural context shifted, but Hollywood's commitment to perfection intensified. Post-war America was a country defining itself through consumption, conformity, and carefully constructed images of success. The ideal American family of the 1950s lived in a suburban house with a manicured lawn, owned a car and modern appliances, dressed well, and presented a perfect image to the world. Beneath the surface, this perfection was often maintained through tremendous effort and anxiety. But the surface was what mattered. Hollywood both reflected and reinforced these ideals. The stars of the 1950s, Grace Kelly, Audrey Hepburn, Rock Hudson, Cary Grant, represented a kind of aspirational perfection that fit perfectly with post-war American values. They were not just beautiful. They were cultivated, refined, controlled. They represented success and the rewards that came with it. There was no room in this image for imperfection. A toupee line or a thinning spot or a hairline that had been chemically removed would undermine the entire fantasy. If the stars were not perfect, if they struggled with the same physical issues as ordinary people, then perhaps the American dream of perfection through effort and consumption was not achievable after all. The irony, of course, was that the perfection on display was entirely manufactured. The very things that made these stars seem perfect, the lighting, the makeup, the hairpieces, the electrolysis, were evidence of their imperfection. But the public was not supposed to know that. The goal was to make perfection seem natural, achievable, almost inevitable for those who tried hard enough. Gender and beauty, different standards, different costs. The different ways Hollywood treated male and female stars' appearances reflected broader cultural attitudes about gender, beauty, and value. For women in 1940s and 1950s America, physical appearance was considered their primary asset. A woman's value was often measured by her attractiveness. Her appearance was something she was expected to work on constantly, to improve and maintain. The effort involved in looking beautiful was expected to be invisible, but the results were mandatory. Hollywood took these cultural attitudes and intensified them. Female stars were required to be not just attractive, but perfect. And that perfection had to appear effortless. The fact that it required hours of labor each day, painful procedures, and sometimes permanent alterations to their bodies was not something the public was meant to know. For men, the standards were different. Male attractiveness was important, but not all important. A man's value could come from other sources: his talent, his power, his accomplishments. And male attractiveness was allowed to be more obviously constructed. The toupee was acceptable because men's appearance was understood to be something they maintained through tools and technology, not something that emerged naturally. These double standards were not unique to Hollywood. They reflected the broader culture. But Hollywood had the power to amplify and broadcast these standards to millions of people. The impossible beauty of female stars became the standard against which all women were measured. The constructed masculinity of male stars became the ideal that men were expected to pursue. The psychological contract with audiences. Hollywood's system of perfection rested on an unspoken contract with audiences. The studios would provide perfect images, perfect fantasies, perfect escapes from reality. In exchange, audiences would buy tickets, read fan magazines, and maintain their belief in the illusion. This contract required audiences to suspend disbelief, to accept that stars naturally looked the way they appeared on screen. It required them to ignore evidence of artifice, the too perfect hairlines, the unchanging appearances, the impossibility of looking flawless at all times. For the most part, audiences were willing partners in this arrangement. They wanted to believe in the perfection. They wanted to maintain the fantasy. And so they chose not to look too closely, not to ask too many questions, not to demand too much reality. But this contract had costs beyond the obvious ones to the stars themselves. It created beauty standards that were literally impossible to achieve without industrial infrastructure and professional help. It taught generations of Americans that physical perfection was not just desirable, but mandatory. It created shame around natural aging, around normal variations in appearance, around being human. The woman who looked in the mirror and saw her own natural hairline, her own natural hair color, her own imperfect face, and felt inadequate, she was living with the legacy of Hollywood's system of perfection. The man who worried about his receding hairline, who felt less masculine because of normal aging, he too was shaped by standards created on Hollywood soundstages. Why the system persisted? Hollywood's system of perfection persisted for decades because it served multiple purposes for multiple constituencies. For studios, it was a way to protect their investments in stars and to maintain the fantasy that sold tickets. For stars, particularly powerful ones, it was a way to extend careers and maintain status. For hair departments and makeup artists, it provided job security and professional recognition. For cinematographers and directors, it was simply the way things were done. And for audiences, despite the impossibility of the standards being set, the system provided something valuable, a vision of perfection, a fantasy world where beauty was absolute and unchanging, where the ugly realities of aging and physical decline did not exist. The system persisted because everyone involved had reasons to maintain it. The costs to the stars who underwent painful procedures, to the women who internalized impossible standards, to the culture that came to view natural human variation as flaw, were diffused and often invisible. The benefits, box office success, extended careers, beautiful images, were immediate and obvious. It would take a cultural revolution to break the system's power. And even then, as we will see, the system would not disappear. It would simply evolve. Act 6. The system breaks down the 1960s, cultural revolution. The studio system began to collapse in the 1960s under pressure from multiple directions. A series of antitrust rulings in the late 1940s and 1950s had forced studios to divest their theater chains, breaking the vertical integration that had made the studio system so powerful. Television provided competition for audiences' attention and entertainment dollars. And a new generation of filmmakers and actors began to reject the old ways of making movies. The stars who emerged in the 1960s brought a different aesthetic to Hollywood, one that valued naturalism over polish. Marlon Brando, who had already shaken Hollywood in the 1950s, represented a new kind of masculinity, raw, emotional, often deliberately ungroomed. His hair was messy. His performances involved sweat and genuine physicality. He looked like a real person, not a polished icon. James Dean, though his career was tragically brief, embodied a similar rejection of Hollywood perfection. His appeal lay partly in his imperfections, in the sense that he was real rather than constructed. The teenage audiences who made him a star were responding to something authentic, or at least something that seemed authentic after decades of obvious artifice. For women, the changes were slower, but equally significant. Actors like Anne Bancroft and Geraldine Page brought a new kind of female star to the screen, intelligent, complex, not primarily defined by physical perfection. Their appeal lay in their talent and presence, not in looking like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. At the same time, American culture was changing in ways that undermined Hollywood's perfection paradigm. The 1960s counterculture rejected the values of the 1950s, including its obsession with image, conformity, and surface perfection. Long hair on men became a symbol of rebellion against conventional standards. Natural beauty, or at least the appearance of natural beauty, became more valued than obvious perfection. The elaborate machinery that had maintained Hollywood's illusion of perfection began to seem not just unnecessary, but old-fashioned, even oppressive. Stars began to appear in public without full makeup. They gave interviews about their insecurities and imperfections. They admitted to cosmetic procedures, breaking the code of silence that had protected Hollywood's secrets for decades. Sidney Guilaroff remained at MGM into the 1970s, but the world he had helped create was disappearing. The wig rooms that had once been essential infrastructure now seemed like relics. The contracts that had given studios total control over stars' appearances were no longer legal or enforceable. The very concept of the studio system star, the carefully constructed, perfectly maintained image, was becoming obsolete. New technologies, persistent obsessions. But if the specific practices of Hollywood's golden age faded, the obsession with perfection did not disappear. It simply took new forms, adapted to new technologies and new cultural contexts. Hair transplants began replacing toupees in the 1970s and 1980s. The procedure, which involved surgically moving hair follicles from one part of the scalp to another, offered a more permanent solution to male hair loss than hairpieces. The early results were often obvious and somewhat crude, but the technology improved rapidly. Cosmetic surgery became increasingly routine for Hollywood stars. Facelifts, nose jobs, chin implants, and countless other procedures allowed stars to alter their appearances more dramatically and more permanently than ever before. What had once required makeup and lighting could now be achieved through surgery. As film technology improved, new tools for creating perfect images emerged. High-definition cinematography initially created problems, exposing flaws that had been invisible in standard definition. But post-production tools quickly evolved to compensate. Digital retouching could remove imperfections, smooth skin, even alter facial structures. CGI could de-age actors or completely replace their faces. The goal remained the same as in the Golden Age, perfect images on screen. But the methods had changed, becoming in some ways more sophisticated and in other ways more invasive. The internalization of standards. Perhaps the most significant change between Hollywood's Golden Age and the modern era is that stars now manage their own perfection rather than having it imposed by studios. The contracts that gave studios control over stars' appearances are gone. Studios no longer employ vast hair and makeup departments that control every aspect of how stars look, but the standards themselves persist. Stars today face the same pressure to be perfect that stars faced in 1940. The difference is that the pressure is now internalized. Stars hire their own hairstylists, makeup artists, personal trainers, and cosmetic surgeons. They manage their own images rather than having them managed by studios. In some ways, this represents an improvement. Stars have more control. They can make their own choices about procedures and alterations. They can refuse demands that feel too invasive or unreasonable. But in other ways, the internalization of these standards is more insidious. When perfection is imposed externally by a studio, there is at least someone to blame, something to resist against. When perfection is internalized, when stars believe that they need to be perfect rather than being told they need to be perfect, the pressure becomes inescapable. The modern celebrity who gets hair transplants, Botox, fillers, and other procedures is making those choices themselves. But they are making them in a culture that still holds them to the impossible standards created in Hollywood's golden age, standards that were always maintained through artifice but were presented as natural. The legacy in modern celebrity culture. Walk through any pharmacy or department store today, and you will see the legacy of Hollywood's golden age beauty standards. Hair dye in impossible colors. Products promising to thicken thinning hair. Makeup that claims to create the perfect face. All of it trades on the fantasy that with the right products and enough effort, anyone can achieve the perfection that was manufactured in Hollywood studios. The cosmetic surgery industry exists largely because Hollywood created and promoted standards of beauty that were achievable only through artificial means. People see perfect faces on screens and in magazines and want to look the same way. They do not know or choose not to remember that those perfect faces are themselves the products of extensive work, surgical, cosmetic, and digital. Social media has intensified these pressures by democratizing the tools of perfection. Anyone can now retouch their photographs, adjust their appearance digitally, present a carefully curated image to the world. The wig rooms of MGM are gone, but their spiritual descendants exist in phone apps that can reshape faces, alter hairlines, change hair color with a touch. The result is a culture where almost everyone is engaged in some version of what Hollywood stars were forced to do in the golden age, present a perfect image while hiding the labor and artifice required to create it. The system that was once imposed on a small number of stars has, in a sense, been extended to everyone. When did the system break down? The question of when Hollywood's golden age beauty system broke down has no single answer. The studio contracts that codified appearance control began to disappear in the 1950s and 1960s. The specific practices, the wig rooms, the industrial-scale hair departments, faded in the 1960s and 1970s as the studio system itself collapsed. But the standards, the expectations, the obsession with perfection, those never really disappeared. They evolved. They adapted. They found new technologies and new methods. But the fundamental principle remained. Stars must be perfect, and whatever effort or intervention is required to achieve that perfection is justified. In this sense, the system never really broke down. It just changed management. Instead of studios controlling stars' appearances, stars now control their own appearances according to the same standards. The coercion is different, market pressure and internalized expectations rather than contractual requirements. But the result is remarkably similar, perfect images maintained through extensive artifice. Act 7. The real cost: what was lost, authenticity and humanity. In creating the perfect images that define Hollywood's golden age, something essential was lost. Not just the hair that was chemically destroyed or the follicles that were permanently removed through electrolysis, but something deeper: the right to be human, the permission to be imperfect. The stars of that era were real people with real insecurities, real struggles, real imperfections. But the system they worked in demanded they hide all of that. And in hiding their humanity, they lost the ability to be fully themselves, even in private. Rita Hayworth, one of the most famous women in the world, felt like a stranger in her own skin. The face that millions adored was not the face she was born with. It had been engineered, perfected, made acceptable according to standards that had no room for her actual heritage. She spent her life knowing that the love directed at her was directed at a construction, not at her. Men fell in love with Gilda, she said, and woke up with her. The real woman was always a disappointment compared to the manufactured image. This sense of fraudulence was not unique to Hayworth. Many stars of the golden age spoke, in later years or in private, about feeling like imposters, like the person the public loved was not real. They had been reshaped so thoroughly, had maintained the artificial image for so long, that they had lost touch with who they actually were beneath the construction. Judy Garland, whose struggles with addiction and mental health are well documented, was in part destroyed by an industry that never allowed her to be imperfect. The girl next door could not have bad days. She could not gain weight. She could not appear without perfect hair and perfect makeup. And so she took pills to wake up, pills to sleep, pills to maintain the energy required to be Judy Garland rather than Frances Gum. The tragedy is that Garland was extraordinarily talented. Her voice, her emotional depth, her ability to connect with audiences, these were real gifts that had nothing to do with her physical appearance. But the industry that benefited from those gifts spent decades telling her that her appearance was more important, that maintaining the image mattered more than anything else, including her health or happiness. Even stars who seemingly had more control, like John Wayne and Bing Crosby, lived with the knowledge that their public image was artificial. Wayne could joke about his hairpiece, but the joke was also an acknowledgement that the Duke was a character he played both on and off screen. Crosby could refuse to wear his hairpiece for troops, but he could not refuse for films without fundamentally altering his career. The cost of perfection was the loss of authenticity. And once lost, authenticity was almost impossible to recover. The stars of Hollywood's golden age lived in gilded cages, admired by millions but unable to be truly seen by anyone, including sometimes themselves. The gendered nature of the cost. If Hollywood's perfection machine exacted a cost from everyone, it cost women more. The procedures women underwent, electrolysis, chemical treatments, extreme dieting, constant wig, wear that damaged their natural hair, were more invasive, more permanent, more damaging than the hairpieces men wore. Rita Hayworth's hairline was permanently altered. The electrolysis destroyed the follicles, ensuring that hair would never grow there again. There was no taking it back, no returning to her original face. She lived the rest of her life with a face that had been shaped by Columbia Pictures' vision of beauty, not her own. Judy Garland's hair never recovered from the years of harsh chemicals and tight styling. The studio's demands on her appearance contributed to a lifetime of body image issues and disordered eating. When she died at 47, her body showed the effects of decades of abuse in pursuit of an image that was never truly hers to control. Bette Davis warned younger actresses about wigs and hairpieces because she had experienced firsthand the physical damage they could cause. Her warning came from a place of genuine concern, but also from the knowledge that the warning would likely not be heeded. The system was too powerful, the pressure too great. Beyond the physical damage was the psychological cost of being told, again and again, that you were not good enough as you were, that your natural hairline was wrong, that your natural color was wrong, that your natural face needed to be fixed. The message was delivered through contracts, through daily interactions with studio executives and hair departments, through the constant monitoring and adjustment of appearance. The women of Hollywood's golden age internalized this message. They came to believe that their worth was tied to their appearance, and that their appearance was never quite acceptable without intervention. This internalization was perhaps more damaging than any physical procedure. It shaped how they saw themselves, how they moved through the world, how they related to their own bodies. Joan Crawford's obsessive control over her appearance in later years was not vanity. It was the logical result of spending decades in a system that told her she could never relax, never be seen as less than perfect. The control she exerted over her image was both a source of power and a prison she could never escape. The industry's blind spots. What makes Hollywood's perfection system particularly tragic is that the industry seemed genuinely blind to the harm it was causing. Studio executives, hair department chiefs, publicity directors, most of them likely believed they were doing their jobs, protecting their investments, giving the public what it wanted. Louis B. Mayer, who ran MGM with an iron fist and controlled every aspect of his stars' lives, probably believed he was building careers, creating legends, making dreams come true. The fact that he was also destroying people, that the system he built ground up human beings and spat out perfect images, likely never registered with him as a problem. Sidney Guilaroff, by all accounts a talented artist and a kind person, spent his career reshaping women's hair and faces. He created some of Hollywood's most iconic looks. But did he understand the cost of those transformations to the women who underwent them? Did he see beyond the perfect result to the person being perfected? The industry's blind spot was in seeing stars as products rather than people. Once you accept that fundamental premise, that a star is an asset to be managed and maintained, then the procedures that damage them become justified. The electrolysis that permanently altered Rita Hayworth's face was not cruelty. It was product improvement. The pills that Judy Garland took to maintain her weight and energy were not abuse. They were necessary maintenance. This mindset persisted because it was profitable. The perfect images sold tickets. The stars who maintained those images made millions for their studios. The system worked economically, even as it failed morally. The specific tragedy of Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth's story deserves special attention because it illuminates so much about what was lost in Hollywood's pursuit of perfection. Hayworth was a talented dancer and actress who would likely have had a successful career without any transformation. But she would not have had the same career. She would not have become Gilda. She would not have become one of the most famous faces of the 20th century. The question that haunts her story is, was the trade worth it? Did the fame, the wealth, the adoration of millions compensate for the loss of her original face, her original identity, her very ethnicity? Hayworth herself seemed to think the answer was no. She spoke about feeling like a fraud. She talked about men falling in love with an image rather than with her. She spent her later years dealing with Alzheimer's disease, which stripped away even the constructed identity that remained, leaving nothing. The erasure of Margarita Cancino to create Rita Hayworth was not just physical. It was cultural. Columbia Pictures looked at a young Spanish-American woman and decided her heritage was unmarketable. And so they removed it, literally follicle by follicle. They raised her hairline to make her look less ethnic. They lightened her hair to make her look more Anglo. They changed her name to remove any hint of her actual background. This was not unusual in Hollywood. Many stars with ethnic backgrounds had their appearances and names changed to make them more acceptable to mainstream white audiences. But Hayworth's case was particularly thorough and particularly well documented. We can see exactly what was done to her. We can trace the transformation from Margarita to Rita, from ethnic to generic, from authentic to manufactured. And we can see what it cost her. Not just physically, though the pain of repeated electrolysis sessions was real, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. She lived her life as someone she was not, maintained an image that was not hers, and was loved for qualities that had been engineered into her rather than qualities she actually possessed. The men who joked, defense mechanism or complicity. John Wayne's jokes about his hairpiece and Bing Crosby's scalp doily comment reveal a different relationship to Hollywood's perfection demands. These men acknowledged the artifice, even mocked it, but they still participated in it. The jokes functioned as a kind of defense mechanism, a way of admitting to the construction while maintaining control over the narrative. By joking about it themselves, they prevented others from using it against them. They controlled how the artifice was discussed. But the jokes also reveal something darker. Wayne and Crosby had the power to joke because they were men, because they had more control over their careers and images than female stars did. Rita Hayworth could not joke about her electrolysis because she had no power over her own narrative. The studio controlled her story, and the studio's story required her transformation to seem natural and desirable rather than painful and coerced. The ability to joke about perfection's artifice was itself a privilege, available primarily to men who had enough power to control how they were discussed. For stars without that power, particularly women, acknowledging the construction was not an option. They had to maintain the illusion completely or face consequences. Long-term health consequences. Beyond the immediate physical and psychological costs, Hollywood's perfection system created long-term health consequences that many stars dealt with for the rest of their lives. The repeated chemical treatments used to dye and style hair damaged it permanently. Many actresses found that by their 40s and 50s, their hair was so damaged that wigs were no longer optional but necessary. The hair that had been subjected to decades of harsh dyes, permanent solutions, and heat styling simply could not recover. The electrolysis that permanently altered hairlines could cause scarring, changes in skin texture, and permanent sensitivity. Rita Hayworth lived with the results of her electrolysis for her entire life. There was no reversing it, no going back. The diet pills, amphetamines, and other drugs used to control weight and energy levels contributed to addiction issues, eating disorders, and long-term health problems. Judy Garland's struggles with addiction began with pills the studio gave her to maintain her weight and energy. What started as studio-mandated medication became a dependence that she could never fully overcome. The psychological toll was equally long-lasting. The internalization of impossible beauty standards, the conviction that one's natural self is inadequate, the feeling of being fraudulent, these issues persisted long after stars left the studio system. The damage done to their sense of self was, in many cases, permanent. The stars who pushed back. Not all stars accepted the system without resistance. Some pushed back against the demands, with varying degrees of success. Katharine Hepburn was known for rejecting many of Hollywood's beauty standards. She wore pants when women were expected to wear dresses. She went without makeup when other stars would not be seen without full face paint. She maintained a more natural appearance than many of her contemporaries. But even Hepburn had to work within the system. She still spent hours in hair and makeup for films. She still had her appearance managed by studio professionals. Her resistance was real but limited. Bette Davis fought Warner Brothers repeatedly over roles, billing, and other issues. Her willingness to fight extended to some aspects of appearance control. She was more willing than many actresses to appear unglamorous on screen when a role required it. But she still subjected herself to the same beauty maintenance as other stars, and she still paid the physical price for it in later years. The stars who pushed back successfully were almost always those with significant power, established stars with box office clout, who could negotiate from a position of strength. For younger stars, for contract players without leverage, resistance was not really an option. The system was too powerful, the consequences of refusal too severe. What could have been different? Is worth considering what Hollywood might have looked like if the perfection system had not developed as it did. What if studios had accepted that stars could look different in different films, that slight variations in appearance were normal and acceptable? What if hairlines that showed natural aging were considered fine rather than flaws to be concealed? The films themselves would likely have been largely the same. The acting, the stories, the cinematography, none of that depended on every hair being in perfect place. Some of the greatest performances in film history were given by actors who looked imperfect, who sweated on camera, whose hair moved naturally. But the system did not develop in that direction because the economic incentives all pushed toward perfection. Perfect images were easier to sell. Perfect stars were more valuable as advertising tools. Perfect appearances made for better publicity photographs, better magazine covers, better fantasy objects. The cost of this economic logic was borne by the stars themselves, particularly female stars who underwent the most invasive procedures. They paid with their bodies, their health, their psychological well-being. And they paid so that studios could sell a more perfect fantasy, so that audiences could escape into a more complete illusion. The unanswerable question. At the heart of Hollywood's perfection system lies an unanswerable question. Was it worth it? Did the beautiful images, the iconic faces, the perfect fantasies justify the cost to the people who created them? For the studios, the answer was clearly yes. The system was profitable. The perfect images sold tickets. The investment in hair departments, wig rooms, and appearance control paid dividends in box office returns. For audiences, the answer is more complicated. They got the fantasy they wanted, the escape they needed. But they also inherited beauty standards that were impossible to meet without professional help, standards that created anxiety and inadequacy for millions of people. For the stars themselves, the answer varied. Some, like Joan Crawford, seemed to embrace the system and the power it gave them. Others, like Rita Hayworth and Judy Garland, clearly felt the cost was too high. Most probably felt somewhere in between, grateful for the opportunities, resentful of the demands, proud of their work, damaged by what it required. The question cannot be answered definitively because the trade-offs were not evenly distributed. The studios gained profits. The audiences gained fantasy. And the stars, particularly the women, paid the price in pain, permanent physical alterations, and psychological damage. Closing, the illusion endures. The studio system that created Hollywood's golden age is long gone. The contracts that gave studios total control over stars' appearances are no longer legal or enforceable. The wig rooms at MGM have been emptied. The elaborate infrastructure of perfection that defined the era has been dismantled. Sidney Guilaroff died in 1997 at the age of 89, taking with him decades of knowledge about how those perfect images were constructed. The Westmore dynasty eventually faded as the studio system that supported it collapsed. Max Factor's company still exists, but the man who persuaded Hollywood to embrace wigs and hairpieces as standard technology is long dead. The physical infrastructure is gone, but the illusion endures. We still expect celebrities to be perfect. We still react with surprise or disappointment when they show signs of being human. We have inherited the beauty standards that were created in those wig rooms, in those makeup departments, in those studio contracts that treated human beings as malleable assets. Walk down any city street, and you will see the legacy of Hollywood's golden age. People dye their hair impossible colors. They undergo cosmetic procedures to fix perceived flaws. They spend billions of dollars on products promising to make them look like the stars on screen. The specific techniques have changed, but the goal remains the same: to achieve the perfection that was manufactured in Hollywood studios nearly a century ago. Perhaps more importantly, we have inherited the lie that perfection is achievable. That with enough money and enough effort and enough willingness to alter ourselves, we can look like the stars we see on screen. That the images in movies and photographs represent something real rather than something constructed through extensive artifice. The truth that Hollywood's golden age buried, that those stars were not perfect, that their images were constructed through painful and invasive procedures, that the hairlines and complexions we admired were often artificial, remains largely buried today. We know more about cosmetic procedures than audiences in 1940 did. We can see the work more clearly, but we still believe in the fantasy. Social media has democratized the tools of perfection. Anyone can now retouch their photographs, adjust their appearance digitally, present a carefully curated image to the world. The wig rooms of MGM are gone, but their spiritual descendants exist in phone apps that can reshape faces, alter hairlines, change hair color with a touch. The system that was once imposed on a small number of stars has been extended to everyone. In 1939, audiences watched Vivien Leigh descend that staircase at 12 Oaks and believed they were seeing perfection. They did not know about the army of craftspeople who had created that image. They did not know about the wigs and the makeup and the lighting and the angles that made it possible. They saw only the result, and they believed it was real. Today, we know more about how images are created. We know about Photoshop and filters and cosmetic surgery. We know that what we see on screen is not reality, that perfection requires construction. We are more sophisticated than audiences in 1939, but we still believe in it. We still chase it. We still hold ourselves and others to standards that were created in Hollywood studios nearly a century ago by men like Sidney Guilaroff and George Westmore, standards that were designed not to reflect reality, but to replace it. The stars of Hollywood's golden age were extraordinary people. They were talented performers who created art that endures. Rita Hayworth's dancing, Judy Garland's singing, Bette Davis's acting. These were real gifts that had nothing to do with whether their hairlines were natural or engineered. The work they created speaks for itself, needs no perfection to validate it. But they were also human beings with receding hairlines and thinning hair and imperfect features. They were people who underwent painful procedures to meet standards they had no part in creating. They were people who lived in fear that the world would discover they were not perfect, that the illusion would crack, that they would be revealed as merely human. And in the end, many of them paid dearly for the privilege of being considered beautiful. Rita Hayworth lived with a face that was not her own. Judy Garland struggled with addiction that began with studio-mandated pills. Bette Davis warned younger actresses about the damage that awaited them. Even John Wayne, who joked about his hairpiece, wore it for decades because removing it would have meant admitting to aging, to being human, to being something other than the Duke. The cost of perfection was not just physical, though the physical damage was real and lasting. The cost was not just psychological, though the psychological toll was immense. The cost was the loss of the right to be human, to be imperfect, to age naturally, to exist as you actually are rather than as someone has decided you should be. That is the real story of Hollywood's hidden imperfections. Not that stars wore wigs or had work done, but that they lived in a system that demanded perfection and punished humanity. A system that told them they were not enough as they were. A system that took their faces, their hair, their very bodies, and reshaped them according to standards that served the industry's profits rather than the people who generated them. The wig rooms are empty now. The studio hair departments have been disbanded. The contracts that codified appearance control have been invalidated. The infrastructure is gone, but the standards remain. The obsession with perfection endures. The belief that beauty requires construction, that natural appearance is insufficient, that being human is something to hide, all of this survives. We are all, in some way, still living in the world that Hollywood's golden age created. Still chasing perfection that was always artificial. Still measuring ourselves against standards that were designed to sell fantasies rather than reflect reality. Still believing that with enough effort, enough intervention, enough willingness to alter ourselves, we can achieve the impossible beauty that was manufactured in those now empty wig rooms. The illusion endures, and so does its cost. Margarita Cancino became Rita Hayworth, and the world fell in love with her. But Margarita was lost, her face permanently altered, her heritage erased, her very identity reshaped to fit someone else's vision of perfection. She lived her life as Rita, famous and adored, and deeply unhappy, always aware that the woman the world loved was not real. That is Hollywood's legacy. Not the films, which remain and continue to move us. Not the performances, which were often brilliant regardless of how the performers looked. But the lie that perfection is real, that beauty is natural, that the images we see require no construction. The stars of Hollywood's golden age paid the price for that lie with their bodies, their health, and often their happiness. And we continue to pay the price with our inherited belief that we too should be perfect, that our natural selves are not enough, that beauty requires intervention and alteration and constant maintenance. The wig rooms are empty, but the standards they help create remain. And we are all still living in their shadow.